Good afternoon. I'm David Chappell. Welcome to this talk on Microsoft Azure for Enterprises. You know, I noticed that in the schedule, they did not print the subtitle, What and Why, which is a shame, because that's what this session is about. I'm going to say nothing about how to use Azure. No demos, no code, nothing. This session is all about what and why. I'm going to talk about what kinds of scenarios I have seen enterprises adopt Azure in, and critically, for each scenario, why? What was the driver? This talk I've actually given a bunch of times around the world, most often to groups of IT leaders, CIOs, head of app dev, head of infrastructure, and so on. Okay? So that's the focus this afternoon. And please notice, I don't work for Microsoft. So what I talk about here is my perspective. I've spent a long time in this world. I've talked to lots and lots of organizations using Azure, considering Azure, and cloud technology in general. But everything I say is just my personal perspective. I in no way speak for Microsoft. Okay? Ready to start? Yeah. All right. You know, I always do this. I feel so overdressed. I look out and I see T-shirts and I think, man, I'm overdressed. But it's freezing in here. What was that? I'm never in the office. I never have a dress code. I dress this way on weekends. I just like this. I don't know. My daughter's 8 years old. She makes fun of me for wearing black all the time. We joined a pool a while ago, and I got to go to the pool with my little daughters who are 8 and 10, and I wear like all black to the pool, and my daughters say, "Daddy, you got to fix this." So I'm working on that. All right. I want to start with the main idea. Again, my perspective, but my perspective is this. It is that pretty much every enterprise today, and by enterprise, I don't mean just giant companies. By enterprise, I mean pretty much organization. Government agencies, mid-sized companies, even small companies, and certainly big companies. Nearly every enterprise today can benefit in some way from using Microsoft Azure. And to have this conversation, I want to frame it in a somewhat of a business context. Let's us think about how change happens. Think about how innovations occur. The first firm to successfully implement some cool new idea, some real innovation, gets often substantial business value, don't they? Think about the first gas station to offer pay at the pump, or the first airline to have check-in kiosks, or the first mobile phone to have those big, lovely touch screens. Okay? Real advantage. But then what happens? Well, what happens is that you can't keep good ideas secret. And so the next firm in the industry implements the same thing, the same innovation. Do they get competitive advantage? They do, but not as much as the first guy. And then what happens? A third firm in the industry implements the innovation. Do they get competitive advantage? Well, probably not much. Because there's a curve here. There's a curve. Ultimately, if you don't have this innovation, you are at a substantial competitive disadvantage. What begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. Today, as BlackBerry knows so well, phones without big touchscreens are non-starters. Gas stations with no pay at the pump are very difficult. Airlines, no check-in kiosks, hopeless. What begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. That's how the process works. Now think about that in terms of IT. For IT spending, there really is this differentiation window. There is this period of time in which that innovation can cause true competitive advantage, real business advantage in the Michael Porter sense. Today, I would argue that virtually every new important innovation in business in that window relies on IT. Do you agree? Think of one that doesn't. Pay at the pump, check-in kiosks, all my examples, all of them do. And so let's call all the IT spending that supports that differentiation window strategic IT. Because strategy really means those things that cause business differentiation. But everything slides down that curve and becomes part of the world we must support. Let's call that utility IT. All the things in our infrastructures We're there once because they gave us real competitive advantage. Then they slide down the curve, okay? So 2 big categories of IT spending. Strategic, which provides true business differentiation, competitive advantage, and utility, all the stuff we got to do to keep the lights on. And you're saying to yourself, this is allegedly a talk about cloud platforms. What is he going on about? Let me tell you, the reason that we should care about this is when you think about what applications need in those 2 phases, strategic and utility, you want very different things. In the strategic phase, you're building applications probably to support some new modern business idea. And what you really care about is elastic resources and speed, fast development. But everything slides down that curve to the utility IT bucket, and once it does, you now care about really different things. Now you want low cost and reliability. 2 very different sets of goals, both important for our organizations. Why is this relevant to us today? Here's why. It's because cloud platforms like Microsoft Azure can help with both. And I'm going to show you how. I'm going to walk through a bunch of scenarios, and I'm going to divide those scenarios into those 2 categories, strategic and utility. Before we do that, however, we must take a little bit of time and talk about Azure itself. I'm going to do the world's shortest Microsoft Azure tutorial, okay? But first, the real basics. What is Azure? You know. It's a public cloud platform, which means it provides computing resources accessible via the internet in data centers scattered around the world. There are more all the time. Great. The minute people realize that public cloud platforms like Azure let you use computing resources and store data in data centers owned by Microsoft someplace else, they all have the same question. I've done, I don't know how many talks on cloud platforms, hundreds. Every single talk, every city, every country, every time, the first question is always some version of this. It is, can a public cloud platform really keep my data and my applications safe? Actually, that's the polite version of the question. More often it's expressed as, David, are you out of your mind? Do you really think I'm going to put my critical business data in a data center owned by Microsoft in Amsterdam or Singapore or somewhere in Washington State? Are you nuts? People say, what about security? What about security? Well, I'm here to tell you this afternoon. This question, despite my subtitle, is not, in fact, about security. Because the answer to this question is you must learn to trust your public cloud provider. This question is about trust. Trust. Why? Well, in your own data center, security is your problem. Maybe some of you run data centers. If so, maybe you lay awake nights thinking, gee, do I have those firewall settings right? In a public cloud platform like Azure, you can have those worries all you want, but you can't do anything about them. Microsoft won't let you go check. Neither will competitors. Amazon, Google, they will not. You have to trust them. Microsoft will take you on a tour. They'll walk you through. They'll say, look, over there, servers. Over there, more servers. Cool, huh? But that's it. They will not let you check these things. You have to trust them. Well, how do we build trust? The answer usually is slowly. You start small, you get some benefit, things go okay. Take the next step, get some more benefit, things go okay. You build. You're going to see in my scenarios, the patterns I see most often in organizations adopting Azure very much reflect that slow build of trust. Not always, but most often. And you know what else? We are so deeply irrational about this issue. I'll meet with the CIO. He'll say, David, I would never trust my data to a public cloud platform. And then he'll send me documents via, Dropbox or OneDrive, right? Which run on Amazon and the Microsoft world, respectively. People are irrational. Or my favorite example. Ask yourself this. What is the world's scariest technology? What is the world's most dangerous technology? Is it nuclear weapons? Is it some rogue computer virus? No. No. The world's scariest technology, the world's most dangerous technology is Windows Update. You laugh. But think about it. Every Patch Tuesday, Microsoft puts directly in your operating system whatever code it feels like. And what do? We say install. How do you know that the last update or the next one isn't inserting code that steals your data? How do you know? The answer is you don't. We trust them. Now think about that. You laughed when I said that. But the level of trust that we have in Microsoft already, and our other vendors as well, via Windows Update, far exceeds anything they ask of us from Azure. I believe we're heading for a world, 5 years, 10 years tops, where if I talked about Windows Azure as being the most dangerous technology, you would laugh. I think the reason we trust Windows Update is because we're used to it, not because the risks are any less than those of Azure. They're arguably greater. I mean, think about this. If tonight it were announced the government of North Korea had purchased all of the Microsoft Corporation, unlikely, I know, but suppose they did, wouldn't you turn off Windows Update? I sure would. The point here is this is a trust issue, and fundamentally we are irrational about trust. I see trust being built more and more and more every day in public cloud technologies. And I expect, barring some disaster, that trajectory to continue. The second question, barring some disaster. And a whole bunch of you just in your brain said Snowden, didn't you? You said Snowden was a disaster. This is America. In America, it's not a huge issue. Outside America, it's a huge issue. I got to tell you, people, if governments want our data, they're going to get our data. They have police. So I don't think Snowden is a huge issue here, especially in America, around this topic. What is a huge issue, though, is question number 2. It's this. It's, can I really meet my regulatory requirements in the public cloud? Because there's all sorts of laws and rules about this. This is harder. This is harder because you have to understand and follow the rules that apply to you. Now, does everybody out there in enterprises using public cloud technologies follow these rules? Oh my God, no. All those folks using Dropbox or OneDrive, putting critical stuff out there in the cloud, do they understand this? No, but they should. And doing this is hard because the laws and regulations differ across vertical markets, and they differ across countries. The result is a matrix of laws and regulations that, frankly, nobody in the whole world understands. Because many of them are somewhat subjective, and many of them, most of them, predate the cloud era. So this can take some effort. At the same time, what I have found over and over and over is that when organizations make the effort and dig in to what really applies to them, they find they can do more than they thought they could. I was in Paris not too long ago. I met with an IT leader from a large French bank, big bank. He told me they'd done a survey of all their data. It's a bank. They found that 90% of their data could legally go in the public cloud. This is France, whose laws, believe me, are no less strict than ours on these issues. So I would encourage you not to let this be a showstopper. It takes some effort, but it need not be a showstopper. Another question that arises that's also, I think, not really a showstopper is this. What about availability? Will these guys be up when they're needed? I've read, people will say, about downtime, and they're right. What you got to do, though, is be careful not to compare the downtime of, say, Azure with perfection. Compare instead with your own data center. In my experience, almost nobody has data centers that are more reliable than the cloud data centers. And these guys have SLAs. They will pay you at least some money if they go down. And the last objection that people tend to have is often unspoken. It is some variation of this. It is, will public cloud platforms make me lose my job? If I'm an IT guy, if I'm a CIO, what happens when more and more goes in the public cloud? Well, the answer is things change. The answer is things change. People who do not like change should not work in the technology industry. If you thought that your current skill set was going to see you through the rest of your career, you're mistaken. And so, as with so much else in our world, we have to reskill, retrain, reinvent. Not everyone, some more than others, but expect those kinds of things to keep happening here. You don't need to know much about Azure to understand the core scenarios or why they might have value for an organization. Got to know a little bit, though. So here we go. Compute. The most important option for enterprises today, I would argue, is this thing called IaaS, Infrastructure as a Service. All it means is you can create VMs in the cloud. Go to a website, say, I want a VM, it's there for you in a few minutes. Wonderful. You can supply your own VHD or use some standard ones, Windows and Linux. There are also two options of what's called Platform as a Service, PaaS, PaaS. The PaaS options, I'll discuss later on a little bit, are similar. Your app is still running in VMs, but the environment is managed for you in some ways, which makes life somewhat easier and faster for the folks building and running applications. I'll come back to that. For storage, there's this thing called blob storage, which is just like a big sand in the sky, binary storage in the sky. Great. You can also run databases in IaaS VMs. You can run SQL Server or Oracle or MySQL or whatever. Notice that MySQL thing there. To perhaps your great surprise, Microsoft seems pretty darn serious about open source in the Azure world. If you care about this, I'm doing a whole session, the same kind of high-level survey talk about open source on Azure on Wednesday afternoon. There's also a PaaS storage option called SQL Database that lets you do managed relational storage. Great. And there's one more thing worth talking about right now, and that's this. You've got your own data center. Azure has its data centers. You can create a VPN connection between them with this thing called Azure Virtual Network. When you do this, you actually take IP addresses from your own space and put them into Azure. So the machines in Azure, the VMs in Azure, look like they're part of your own, another subnet in your network. Great. That's all you have to know. Those basic technologies underlie pretty much all of the core scenarios for enterprises for Azure today, at least the starting ones that I see most often. But there's just one more thing we have to talk about, and that's money. In so many situations, not all, but in so many, the driver for Azure is cost. And so to understand why the costs can be more attractive here, you must have the basics of Azure pricing. So here we go. Three big things make up most of the cost of the most essential scenarios here. First, compute. You pay for VMs by the hour. You can see here the price ranges depending on how big the VM is, how much memory, how many cores, and what its functionality is. Some have stuff inside them. You pay per hour. Start it up, you pay, shut it down, you stop. Very nice. For storage, you pay per gigabyte per month. You can see here relational storage in a SQL database costs more than ordinary binary storage with blobs. But the prices range quite a bit here. I should tell you, every time I do this talk, including this one, a day or two before, I always go and check all these prices. Why? Because they change all the time. And do you think they ever go up? No. No. They're dropping like a stone. They're dropping like a stone. You know why? Let's digress for a second and discuss this overall market of cloud platforms. In the keynote this morning, Brad Anderson mentioned 3 companies that have the scale to do this. He mentioned Microsoft. The other 2 are Amazon and Google. All 3 are selling IaaS, blob storage, the basics of cloud platforms. Think about that. 3 massive competitors offering what are to a very great degree commodities. VMs by the hour, Windows and Linux, blob storage, commodities. Massive scale, very similar offerings. In markets like this, what happens to prices? Answer, they are driven to costs. What we are seeing is 3 giant players, at least one of whom, Amazon, is used to very tiny margins, pushing these prices down relentlessly. They're dropping like a stone. This is the heart of why I would argue that within 5 years, 10 years tops, probably 5, pretty much everything new that you do will be in the public cloud, because it will be so much cheaper than anything else you can do. The way prices are dropping here is astonishing. These guys can buy and run hardware, all of these things, at prices vastly better than you. I don't care who you are, Microsoft has more computers than you do. And so these prices drop like a stone. If you work for the NSA, see me later, okay? Right. But otherwise, these big players are driving costs down enormously. And Microsoft has sworn publicly to never let Amazon beat it in price. So whenever Amazon cuts, Microsoft cuts. When Microsoft cuts, Amazon cuts. Google cut last spring, everybody followed them. Those 3 guys are driving forward. By the way, I'm at a loss about how any other vendor in the public cloud platform space is going to have a business going forward. IBM, HP, I'm mystified, because none of them anything close to the scale of Microsoft, Amazon, Google. And that's driving these prices in a massive way. So, all right, the third piece of your bill typically will be bandwidth. They charge you nothing to move data into Azure data centers. Microsoft is happy to have you give them data they can then charge you to store. They're good with this, okay? But when you move data out of a data center, they charge you. And how much they charge depends on how much you move and where you are in the world. Bandwidth costs more Asia Pacific just because bandwidth costs more in Asia Pacific. You get these long cable runs and so on. So those 3 things are not the only costs, but they're the main drivers of costs in the most critical enterprise scenarios I'm going to talk about. All right? So with that, let's go back where I started. Oh, I'm sorry, one more thing here, one more thing. I'm showing you list prices, rack rates. Many of you, probably most of you, have enterprise agreements with Microsoft or some other larger kind of thing, okay, some kind of agreement. If you get those, you will never see these prices. You'll get discounts of various kinds, just to be clear about that. All right. Scenarios. I promised you examples. I also promised you I would divide them into 2 big, broad categories. The categories, based on the curve I showed you earlier, are strategic and utility. And I'm going to start with utility. In my experience, you can start anywhere you want, but I've chosen to start with utility here in this discussion. That's the right side of the curve. That's the area in which low cost and reliability are the critical drivers. All right? The other part of the curve is mostly about new apps, and I'll do that after this. The big scenarios in this part of the curve that I see most often are these: using blob storage, using VMs for dev test, deploying packaged apps like SharePoint in the cloud, and at some point, not initially generally, but at some point, moving existing on-prem apps to the public cloud. You know, after this morning's announcement of the new disaster recovery features in Azure, I would definitely add disaster recovery to this list. For the next run through of this talk, I will add DR as a scenario, but it's not here yet. Okay. So, blob storage. As you might know, blob is an acronym for a binary large object. And that's all it is. It's just a bunch of bytes up there in the cloud. So how might you use it? Well, one common approach is this device called Store Simple, a company Microsoft bought a little while ago. Store Simple is actually an appliance. It's hardware with local disk that goes in your data center. It's like a SAN, but it's a relatively small SAN, because what it does, is it moves data back and forth to blob storage. There are various algorithms. The most obvious is just an LRU cache. If stuff stops being used for a while, it gets shoved off to Azure Blob Storage. When you access it again, it gets pulled back down. Okay? It's like a cache that moves things back and forth to blob storage. How else might you do this? Backup. SQL Server today has built-in support for backing up to blob storage, as do other Microsoft technologies like the backup facility in System Center. And of course, you might build apps that use video or whatever else and store it on Azure Blobs. Okay? So there's lots of ways you might use blobs. That's the what. How about the why? Why would you do this? Overwhelmingly, in my experience, people who want to use this do it because of lower cost. Here's an example. Suppose I've got a terabyte stored in geo-redundant blobs. What does that mean? Geo-redundant means that you have your blobs stored in one Azure data center, such as Amsterdam, and it's also got a copy in another data center in the same region, such as Dublin. You got a copy there, okay? Why do you do that? Disaster recovery. The data center goes down completely, your data is still there. It's an option, but I chose to use it here because it is the most expensive option. What I'm showing you here is the most you can pay for blob storage. This is the highest price they offer today, okay? It goes down from here based on the options you choose, size of data, and so on. But a terabyte of data, geo-redundant, suppose you're doing 10 million reads and writes a month, you charge a tiny bit for reads and writes, a tiny bit, and you're moving half a terabyte out each month. The costs look like that. The total, in the US and Europe, $121.50 a month for a terabyte of geo-redundant data. I ask you, is that expensive? Is that cheap? It's cheap, right? It's really cheap. It's really cheap. So this is the compelling reason why lots of people, in my experience, begin using cloud platforms, e.g. Windows Azure, Microsoft Azure, with blob storage. Oh, and by the way, the Store Simple device encrypts data before it goes up and decrypts when it comes back down, and you hold the key, not Microsoft. So some of that helps folks get around the trust issues, the regulatory issues for doing this. Another scenario with which I see enterprises begin to walk into the Microsoft Azure world is using VMs for dev test. So an IT admin or developer can use the Azure Management Portal to create some nice IaaS VMs, and developers can then go ahead and use those to build their apps, Windows or Linux, either one. And if you want to, you could have a more complete environment with a VPN connection between your data center and an Azure data center. You can also actually run Active Directory in both places. Now, that's not Windows Azure AD, which you might have heard of. That's actually ordinary vanilla Windows Server AD, where you run a domain controller up there on Azure. You can now make Azure part of your domain or part of your forest, whatever you think is best. Now, same scenario. You create IaaS VMs, and your developers can use them for dev test. Why would you do this? Well, it's a fast and easy way to get inexpensive VMs. Developers can have this environment up and running in 5 minutes. They can have their own VHDs if they want to. They can build apps up there that are meant to run in the cloud or on premises, either one. It's interesting. And this is also the case. I talk to lots of developers who say that in their own environment, their IT guys just so lock down the VMs that even for dev tests, they can't install the tools they need. The VMs are so locked down. If you're a developer, these are yours. That's kind of cool. If you're an IT pro, I know you hate that for good reasons. But nonetheless, developers often do this because they can. It's also useful for not just dev test, but for proof of concepts or any kind of innovative scenario, and the VPN connections are really cheap, 5 cents an hour. Also, starting here with Azure turns out to be a good way to build trust. Why? Because you're doing this thing that's not mission critical, typically, and most often you're not using real data. Most often, with dev test scenarios, you've got test data in the cloud, so you're not subject to regulatory concerns. This is why VMs for dev test and blob storage are the two most common scenarios that I see enterprises begin with as they start embracing public cloud platforms like Windows Azure. And once they've built trust, what do? Well, then they start doing other things, like maybe deploying SharePoint. If I want a SharePoint farm, I can deploy that farm on premises possibly, or I can deploy the farm on IaaS VMs on Azure. My users don't care. They can't even tell. So why would I do this? Why would I deploy SharePoint? Or Dynamics CRM, or whatever, packaged apps. Why would I do this on Windows Azure? The most common reasons I see here are these. Number one, faster deployment. You don't need to wait for central IT. If I'm a business unit in some large organization, I go to my IT guys, I say, I need a new SharePoint farm. They say, absolutely, we'll get right on it in 6 to 8 months. Right? Here, they can deploy their own SharePoint farm, and they can start this afternoon. That's really appealing to a lot of people. But I know that some of you are thinking this. You're thinking, well, David, your slide says there's no need to wait for central IT. But you're thinking, I am central IT. I don't want you going around me. Yeah, well, you know what? Make your peace with that, people. Even if your CIO is a graduate of the Joseph Stalin School of IT Management, you will never stop these guys. I talked to a guy recently whose CIO was so incensed by business groups going to the cloud around him that the CIO went to the CFO and said, make them stop. And the CFO said, well, no. If you can't make them happy, then they should use something else. CIO went to the CEO and said, make them stop. The CEO said, well, no. The CIO went to the board of directors and said, make them stop. And the board said, get out of our mahogany panel room. The CIO lost. I've never seen a CIO win this battle because, you know, ultimately we work for them, right? Kind of a shame, but there it is, right? And so they win. It's a much better strategy, I would suggest, to become the people that can help business units use the cloud more effectively. Don't try to stop them. Try to steer them toward things you know you can manage, such as Azure with System Center. So the world becomes part of what you know already. Try to guide them. Trying to stop them is a fool's errand in my experience. It doesn't work. Also, this kind of thing makes IT become an operating expense rather than a capital expense. You're not ponying up giant checks every few years. You're instead doing OpEx. Now, there are CFOs who hate this. They want CapEx IT. There are CFOs who love this. So that can be a plus or a minus, depending on your organization. And finally, I've said this already, lower cost. Azure is probably cheaper today than your own data center, especially if you're less than a global enterprise. And I promise you, it will be cheaper tomorrow. This ongoing cutthroat competition among Amazon, Google, Microsoft is just driving prices down to the bone. Google this spring had this massive cut in IaaS, like 40%, 50%, huge. Others had to follow. So it's going to get way cheaper than it is today. Finally, once organizations truly have built trust, I don't see people start here. Heck no. But once they've gone through these steps, maybe some storage, maybe some dev test, deploy a SharePoint farm, build some trust in the cloud, work with regulatory concerns, now they say, well, wait a minute, when it's time to build a new data center, when my hardware is depreciated, why am I doing this? Why am I going to build a big data center? CEOs of non-technology companies despise writing checks for data centers. They hate it. And so at that point, you can start saying, well, let's just have all the growth be in the public cloud. Packaged apps become SaaS apps, software as a service. Custom apps, on-prem apps, become apps running on Azure, for example. So I can, again, create some IaaS VMs. I can move my apps up there. My users just don't care. Why would I do this? Again, lower cost. An example. Suppose my app, relatively small app, requires 2 medium Azure VMs. They cost 18 cents an hour each, running all the time. It's a fairly small app, 100 gig database. You can see my assumptions there for data transfer and so on. The pricing works out like this. In the US, $2.80 a month to run this app. So I ask you again, is that expensive? Is that cheap? With storage, you all knew the answer, because people know their storage costs by and large. With this, I'd bet the answer for all of you is we don't really know, because people don't really know what it costs them to run an individual app. They don't have that pricing information. If you think this is interesting, I would encourage you to start understanding your current on-prem costs today. Because to make these arguments in a clear way, they are makeable, absolutely. But if you ask the current on-prem people what the costs are to run things on-prem, they will lie to you. That's you, I know, some of you, sorry about that, right? You're thinking, well, wait, that's my job. I'm not going to give it to them. We're very cheap to run things here. Well, maybe. But knowing your current on-prem cost is really important for making the cost argument for having better benefits in the future of running in the public cloud. Am I suggesting all of you do this afternoon? Heck no. I think that's irrational. What I am suggesting is that we're going to wind up there. We are for sure going to wind up there. We're going to wind up, not everything, but new stuff. More and more new stuff is going to wind up in the cloud. In fact, why doesn't your organization have a cloud-first policy? Why doesn't your organization always approach new packaged app purchases, new custom apps, by saying, can this be in the cloud? Can we buy a SaaS solution? Can we run this app on Azure? If there's a good reason why the answer is no, then back away. But why not be cloud first today? Because, well, let me ask the room. Who in the room believes, who agrees with me, that within 5 years, 10 years tops, almost all new stuff will in the public cloud? Who agrees with me? Yeah, I see almost all the hands. So if that's true, then why in the world wouldn't you start today? If you want to be there in 10 years, I would suggest you want to start here next week. So to me, organizations should all have cloud-first policies. Not cloud only by any means. I'm not saying that. Don't be irrational. But cloud first. There you have it. The 4 scenarios I see most often. And again, as I've said, enterprises tend to start with the first couple, blobs, VMs for dev test, and move on to deploying things like SharePoint. And the last thing is moving their current apps up to the cloud. That takes trust. That takes regulatory issues being addressed. That takes time to get to. But that is the goal I see in more and more organizations. And again, one more thing. Given today's announcements, I would add business continuity / disaster recovery as a scenario here as well, which I will add for my next run through this talk. All right. Our last section, the last category of scenarios, strategic IT. Those are the things in the first part of the curve. Those are the things that provide true competitive advantage, and hence are strategic, again, in the Michael Porter sense. And what those really turn out to be is custom apps. The apps might be employee-facing, inward-facing, They might be customer-facing, outward-facing, or in their own unique category, I think, they might be parallel apps. And so let's discuss those three things in the context of Microsoft Azure. Before I do that, however, I want to go meta on you here. Right? Take a step back. Why do organizations build new applications? Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, because they want to improve how they execute a current business model. The canonical example there, the paradigmatic illustration, is automating some existing business process. We've done that for decades now, right? You improve how some business process operates by automating it. Makes it faster, more reliable, just better generally. Great. But the other reason the enterprises build new apps is to support a new business model, to do something new, like offering self-service access to your customers. I don't know about you, but for a long time, I just hated that term business model. I hated it because no two people used it in the same way. It drove me nuts. But today, I love the term business model because I've discovered something called the business model canvas, which I think is a very, very clear way to think about business models. To find this book, you can see a reference here, called Business Model Generation. Let me ask, who's ever heard of this before? Ooh, almost nobody. Listen to me, people. Your entire trip to Tech Ed is worthwhile because you heard about this concept today. Right? This is not my idea by any means, right? Go buy this book. I'll wait. Right? No, you got to buy this book. It's really important. This is such a cool idea because it so helps you think clearly about business models, and that's fundamental to grasping what kinds of new apps you ought to be building, and thus how to exploit the cloud. I'm going to take 5 minutes here, less, and talk about this. If you're thinking to yourself, come on, I write code for a living. Bear with me. This is important. Every business model at the heart has a value proposition. What are you offering? What value are you providing? Then, there are the customer aspects. What customer segments are you targeting? What channels do you use to reach those customers? What kinds of relationships do those channels allow? Then there are the resources, infrastructure. What are your key activities, your key resources? Who are your key partners? And finally, there's money, the revenue stream, the cost structure. Those 9 boxes provide a remarkably simple and useful way to think about business models. If you read the book, they go through all kinds of examples, search, lots more with this particular thing in mind. Now, this is relevant here because I encourage you to think about the way in which applications built on Microsoft Azure can potentially let your organization create and exploit and get value from new business models. What kinds of value propositions might you build? For example, maybe you want to reach new customer segments because cloud applications can let you go after smaller customers and partners more cheaply. Or maybe cloud apps give your customers more self-service and thus change that relationship. Or maybe they let you disintermediate your channels. You can sell right to customers. Cloud apps can also do things like change your activities. Some aspects of in-house IT, like rolling in servers, hooking up storage, aren't needed in a pure cloud world. You can reallocate some of those activities. Your resources change. Massive, cheap computing power is no longer a differentiator. A big European financial services company hired me a while ago to do a half-day cloud seminar for their executive team, CEO, CIO, CFO, and so on. They had built a model in which they thought they were unique and different because they had massive data centers. Great. Along come public cloud platforms, which give 2 guys with a laptop and a credit card access to global class data centers. Right? No longer a differentiator. So your key resources have changed. Your key partners, well, gee, in this world, who you choose as your cloud platform provider is a really important decision. They're a very important partner. Your cost structure is bound to change. You'll see in a few minutes here the way Azure is priced. Some kinds of apps, like very spiky apps, become feasible that wouldn't be otherwise. And maybe the most important revenue stream here, pay-as-you-go computing means that you pay for what you use and shut things down when you're done. What this means is you can try more new stuff at lower cost. If you can try more new stuff, you'll have more chances to innovate successfully, and one hopes more successful innovations. That is perhaps the biggest change this brings, the ability to try more new business models, more new apps supporting the innovations, and one hopes make more progress. End of meta. Back to scenarios. Suppose you want to build a new application for your own employees to use. It's an employee-facing application. You might well build that on IaaS, on Microsoft virtual machines, Azure virtual machines. Great. You can run databases. You can do all the things I showed you earlier. Build the app in .NET or in Java or in all kinds of devices. It's a Windows and Linux world, whatever you want. Why would you do this? Well, it's fast. You don't need to wait for central IT. You can just get VMs this afternoon and start working. We saw that earlier with the SharePoint example. There's also stuff you can't get easily otherwise. Suppose, for example, that your app needs to be used by employees around the world and you want good response time. Well, you can run the app on Azure in data centers in the US, Australia, Japan, other parts of Asia, Europe, South America. Good response time. Also, you can scale up and down easily. This can matter a lot for spiky apps. Microsoft themselves has an application that they've moved to Azure for these reasons. The story is this. Microsoft apparently does employee evaluations twice a year, every 6 months. Every 6 months, there's a giant spike in managers using this app, but it sits idle much of the rest of the time. Well, the app now runs on Azure. Microsoft spins up lots of VMs during the spike time and then shuts most of them down during the fallow time. Makes sense. And again, you might build employee-facing apps, new ones, on Azure because it's cheaper. If it's not today, I promise you, it will be going forward. You might also choose to build new employee-facing applications, not on IaaS, but on PaaS. I mentioned PaaS a bit earlier, Platform as a Service. In Azure, there are a couple different PaaS services, Azure Websites, Azure Cloud Services. You might choose to build the app on PaaS. Why? Because PaaS lets you build and deploy the app more quickly. With IaaS, you must create the VMs, get things set up. With PaaS, you say, platform, here's my app, run my app. And the platform sets things up for you. It's faster. It's also easier and cheaper to manage because the platform does management for you, patches Windows, does things like that. And finally, since there are fewer things for you to do as far as management and deployment, there are fewer things for you to screw up. So, lower risk. PaaS has some real benefits for new apps. At the same time, not all new apps are built on PaaS. Some developers prefer IaaS. Going forward, though, I would expect to see more and more and more new apps built on a PaaS foundation. How about customer-facing apps? This is an app that you're building to speak to your customers, not your employees. Here, you might build on PaaS again, as I've just shown you. You could do IaaS too. I'm showing you PaaS. Great. Why would I choose to do this here? Why build a new customer-facing app on Windows Azure? Why do companies do it? In my experience, the single biggest reason is to get stuff they can't easily get otherwise, principally massive scale. You know, 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, when you talked about big scale, you mean enterprise apps. You know, big scale was apps inside the enterprise. Today, enterprise scale apps are laughable compared to big internet apps, just laughable. And so nobody, almost nobody, really needs massive scale for internally facing apps. Where you need massive scale is when you're writing apps for your customers, for the public internet, for the great unwashed, all those people out there. And so for that scenario, a public cloud platform is really appealing. You also have very easy up and down scaling. Add new VMs, shut them down as you stop using them. You've got high reliability because there's multiple Azure data centers. You can have your app run here and there and there and there, and failures here can cause traffic redirected over there. All those things are in the platform. Data centers around the world, and there's even a built-in NoSQL database service. And you can run your own NoSQL if you want to for massive scale. So, some good reasons there. Lower cost, once again, always shows up. And especially with PaaS, it will probably be faster and easier to deploy. In my experience, the most common reason I've seen enterprises build customer-facing apps on Azure is the scale issue. But not the only one, because here's the thing. Thing is, I can build almost anything on Azure, almost anything. But there are some kinds of applications where Windows Azure is all but required. That's too strong. Where building on Azure is an obviously smart thing to do. Let me run through some categories here that are like that. Some categories of situations where building on Azure is almost a no-brainer. If I need fast access to computing resources with no commitment, I want VMs now, I want to shut them down whenever I feel like it. That's a classic Azure scenario. Like what? Like a marketing website. Your CMO says, I've got this great new marketing campaign, I want to roll it out next week, or better yet, this afternoon. And I'm not really sure how big a success it's going to be. If it's a huge success, then I want it to run at scale for a year. If it crashes and burns, we'll shut it down in a couple of weeks. That's a great Azure scenario. Can scale, can shut down no problem. An app that requires massive or global scale, like consumer web apps, as I said before, that's also an obvious public cloud platform scenario. An app that has very spiky usage. I gave you the example of the Microsoft employee evaluation app. There are lots of apps like this, though, out in the world as well. I talked to a guy in New Zealand who built an online ticket sales app on Azure. Now that app, think about the app. Most of the time, the load is like this, nothing going on, and then tickets go on sale for, oh, I don't know, Lady Gaga, let's say. And there's this giant spike in usage. Actually, has her day passed? Maybe. Who's the current, like, Lady Gaga? Or who's the really hot ticket out there? I don't know. Maybe it's the Lady Gaga. It doesn't matter. I love Lady Gaga. I can't help myself. I hope she has more stuff coming. Anyway, big spike for the Lady Gaga. Then she sells out in 3 hours, and it drops down to nothing. That kind of scenario is perfect for a cloud platform. I know some guys in Australia who built a nationwide testing service that does online tests 1 day a month. But that 1 day a month, they've got to handle lots of people around the country. To build that on physical servers would require all this money in servers sitting unused most of the time. Building on Azure made perfect sense. Spin up the VMs for the day, pay for the day, shut them down. That kind of scenario ought to ring a bell in your mind that says, this is an Azure scenario. There are cases where running the app on premises raises security issues. I have seen a number of organizations choose to build apps on Azure because they thought it was more secure. Now, what's that all about? Well, again, the canonical example here that I've seen is backends for enterprise mobile apps. Suppose you want to build an application that lets your customers, from their phones, let's say, access enterprise data. Cool. Build the back end inside your enterprise data center, have it access the data, give it to customers. But the guys in the data center might well say, not on my watch. We're not going to let customers' mobile phones through our firewall to access data. Are you out of your mind? What I've seen companies do instead is put that back end on Azure and then move data back and forth as needed from the data center, because they felt it was just too insecure to have mobile phones punching through firewalls to enterprise data centers. And finally, Customers that just don't want in-house IT. Who are those people? Startups. Every single startup in the world is cloud only. That's too strong, but by about this much. Right? They're virtually all cloud only. And if startups are cloud only, well, then why aren't you? Why should only startups have the advantage? I see progressive businesses taking the same approach. So, some examples of situations where you ought to say to yourself, this might well be a good scenario for Azure. All right. The last category here of applications, parallel applications. They deserve their own category because they're different. And there are two subcategories below parallel apps. The first subcategory is commonly called high-performance computing, HPC. Microsoft calls it big compute sometimes. What it means is I can create VMs, I can run apps in those VMs, and process in parallel. People do this when they want lots and lots and lots of CPU power, and the application can be done in parallel. So, for example, what people do here? Simulations. Simulations are a great example here of car crashes, nuclear explosions, or bond portfolio performance simulations. Another great example is rendering. These animated movies we see, or the digital effects, have to be rendered. And they use render farms in public cloud platforms more and more to do that. When you need lots of CPU power and your problem is parallelizable, it need not be done sequentially, then this kind of thing makes great sense. And the rise of Windows Azure and technologies like it is so important here. Here's why. It's because without a technology like Azure, if your company could benefit from this kind of parallel computation, such as bond portfolio simulation, today, before this, you had to go buy a bunch of physical servers and maintain your own cluster. Lots of money. Only big companies could do it. With Azure, we see the democratization of access to that power because you can now spin up the VMs when you want them, use them for an hour, 2 hours, 10 hours, shut them down. Stop paying. It's a great thing. No matter how big your firm is, you can now get the benefit from this if you need it. The second category of parallel applications is not concerned with getting lots of CPU power in parallel, but rather with getting lots of disk accesses in parallel. That's what big data is all about. And for big data, there is really only one technology that has come to rule them all. Everyone uses the same basic approach for unstructured big data today. It's Hadoop. You are free to build your own Hadoop cluster on Windows Azure in VMs if you want to. But only masochists, people who enjoy paying, will do this. There is a service called HD Insight that lets you say, I'd like a Hadoop cluster, please, with 8, 16, 64 VMs. It creates it. You can then run your job in the MapReduce model and get the results. Here, the goal is not lots of CPU power. It's to process lots of data in parallel, lots of data reads. You often do very simple things in the data, like just search for stuff. The point is, just as pay-by-the-hour VMs democratizes access to HPC applications, this democratizes access to big data applications. It's important. Why do folks do this? I've said these things already. Lower cost, on-demand access for both clusters and Hadoop clusters. Okay. So, there you have it. A summary of the scenarios for strategic IT. And we're done. Let me summarize here. I have argued for the last hour or so that public cloud platforms can provide both lower cost and high reliability for utility apps, as well as better support for strategic apps, for business requirements, and so on. In fact, I would posit but at least one of these scenarios, utility or strategic, probably has value for every enterprise today. Let me ask the room. Who in the room thinks that at least one of those has value for your organization today? At least one. At least one. All right. I see almost all the hands. Great. Let me ask again. For whom is that scenario blob storage? Store simple, some kind of blob storage thing. Some of you. For whom is it VMs for dev test? Ah, okay, this is tech ed, right? Who is anything else? Anything else? A few of you. What else? Somebody shout out. What else? Business apps. Regular business apps. Okay. Pardon me? Database? Okay. Simulations. Great. Great. All right. All right. You know, I've done this talk a lot, often to smaller groups, more interaction. I always end the talk by asking that question. And you know what? All the hands always go up, like today. And the answers are usually what I heard here today. Store simple or blob storage, VMs for dev test, and some other things. But the truth is that I think my original contention is still true, that pretty much every organization can get some value from some scenario on Azure today. So, my final thought, what are you waiting for? Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm David Chappell. Welcome to this talk on Microsoft Azure for Enterprises. You know, I noticed that in the schedule, they did not print the subtitle, What and Why, which is a shame, because that's what this session is about. I'm going to say nothing about how to use Azure. No demos, no code, nothing. This session is all about what and why. I'm going to talk about what kinds of scenarios I have seen enterprises adopt Azure in, and critically, for each scenario, why? What was the driver? This talk I've actually given a bunch of times around the world, most often to groups of IT leaders, CIOs, head of app dev, head of infrastructure, and so on. Okay? So that's the focus this afternoon. And please notice, I don't work for Microsoft. So what I talk about here is my perspective. I've spent a long time in this world. I've talked to lots and lots of organizations using Azure, considering Azure, and cloud technology in general. But everything I say is just my personal perspective. I in no way speak for Microsoft. Okay? Ready to start? Yeah. All right. You know, I always do this. I feel so overdressed. I look out and I see T-shirts and I think, man, I'm overdressed. But it's freezing in here. What was that? I'm never in the office. I never have a dress code. I dress this way on weekends. I just like this. I don't know. My daughter's 8 years old. She makes fun of me for wearing black all the time. We joined a pool a while ago. Curve here. There's a curve. Ultimately, if you don't have this innovation, you are at a substantial competitive disadvantage. What begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. Today, as BlackBerry knows so well, phones without big touchscreens are non-starters. Gas stations with no pay at the pump are very difficult. Airlines, no check-in kiosks, hopeless. What begins as an innovation becomes an obligation. That's how the process works. Now think about that in terms of IT. For IT spending, there really is this differentiation window. There is this period of time in which that innovation can cause true competitive advantage, real business advantage in the Michael Porter sense. Today, I would argue that virtually every new important innovation in business in that window relies on IT. Do you agree? Think of one that doesn't. Pay at the pump, check-in kiosks, all my examples, all of them do. And so let's call all the IT spending that supports that differentiation window strategic IT. Because strategy really means those things that cause business differentiation. But everything slides down that curve and becomes part of the world we must support. Let's call that utility IT. All the things in our infrastructures were there once because they gave us real competitive advantage. then they slide down the curve. Okay? So too big Azure, you know. It's a public cloud platform, which means it provides computing resources accessible via the internet in data centers scattered around the world. There are more all the time. Great. The minute people realize that public cloud platforms like Azure let you use computing resources and store data in data centers owned by Microsoft someplace else, they all have the same question. I've done, I don't know how many talks on cloud platforms, hundreds. Every single talk, every city, every country, every time, the first question is always some version of this. It is, can a public cloud platform really keep my data and my applications safe? Actually, that's the polite version of the question. More often it's expressed as, David, are you out of your mind? Do you really think I'm going to put my critical business data in a data center owned by Microsoft in Amsterdam or Singapore or somewhere in Washington State? Are you nuts? People say, what about security? What about security? Well, I'm here to tell you this afternoon. This question, despite my subtitle, is not, in fact, about security. Because the answer to this question is you must learn to trust your public cloud provider. This question is about trust. Trust. Why? Well, in your own data center, security is your problem. Maybe some of you categories of IT spending. Strategic, which provides true business differentiation, competitive advantage, and utility. All the stuff you got to do to keep the lights on. And you're saying to yourself, this is allegedly a talk about cloud platforms. What is he going on about? Let me tell you, the reason that we should care about this is when you think about what applications need in those two phases, strategic and utility, you want very different things. In the strategic phase, you're building applications probably to support some new modern business idea. And what you really care about is elastic resources and speed, fast development. But everything slides down that curve to the utility IT bucket, and once it does, you now care about really different things. Now you want low cost and reliability. Two very different sets of goals, both important for our organizations. Why is this relevant to us today? Here's why. It's because cloud platforms like Microsoft Azure can help with both. And I'm going to show you how. I'm going to walk through a bunch of scenarios, and I'm going to divide those scenarios into those two categories, strategic and utility. Before we do that, however, we must take a little bit of time and talk about Azure itself. I'm going to do the world's shortest Microsoft Azure tutorial, okay? But first, the real basics. What is Azure? I got to go to the pool with my little daughters who are 8 and 10, and I wear like all black to the pool, and my daughters say, Daddy, you got to fix this. So I'm working on that. All right, I want to start with the main idea. Again, my perspective, but my perspective is this. It is that pretty much every enterprise today, and by enterprise, I don't mean just giant companies. By enterprise, I mean pretty much organization. Government agencies, mid-sized companies, even small companies, and certainly big companies. Nearly every enterprise today can benefit in some way from using Microsoft Azure. And to have this conversation, I want to frame it in a somewhat of a business context. Let's us think about how change happens. Think about how innovations occur. The first firm to successfully implement some cool new idea, some real innovation, gets often substantial business value, don't they? Think about the first gas station to offer pay at the pump, or the first airline to have check-in kiosks, or the first mobile phone to have those big, lovely touchscreens. Okay? Real advantage. But then what happens? Well, what happens is that you can't keep good ideas secret. And so the next firm in the industry implements the same thing, the same innovation. Do they get competitive advantage? They do, They do, but not as much as the first guy. And then what happens? A third firm in the industry implements the innovation. Do they get competitive advantage? Well, probably not much, because there's a